We've done things like community visioning workshops, coming up with alternative plans for sites. We've done the more traditional kind of, blockade, chalk up the pavement kind of thing. Guerrilla gardening, as we talked about earlier, and a bunch of the people from Right to the City Brisbane were also recently involved in organising People's Pride, which was a pride festival, but that was also explicitly decommodified, so free for entry, and was explicitly a space aimed at being inclusive to some of the more marginalised people in the LGBTQI community, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander queer people. First and foremost, the giant elephant in the room is that this is a struggle for space on stolen land. So the most obvious question we need to grapple with is when trying to discuss a right to the city in a settler colonial context, we are making claims for land that is already stolen, already occupied. And this is an intractable problem. And I mean, acknowledging that this is a problem is not sufficient. It's not sufficient action. And I will say, we're yet, in the kind of more academic sense, we're yet to see much serious work grappling with this idea about how you reconcile rights to the city in a settler colonial context. That's not something that we've seen a lot of. And so this is something the Right to the City Brisbane is struggling to find ways to work out. Not perfect, but there's some interesting attention being placed on it. I think it is absolutely essential to ensure that movements for a right to the city support and prioritise movements for justice for First Peoples, for reparations and for sovereignty, but also particularly in cities. Cities have been home to various practices of colonialism and still are. They are biopolitical sites through which the conditions of life for Indigenous people have often been governed. Cities have been synonymous with displacement and with dispossession. It has also been said that cities are where indigeneity goes to die, which is awful. But that's a really common belief, that cities extinguish Indigenous connections to country. But that claim has been increasingly contested, particularly in recent years, which is interesting and exciting to see and important to see. We know that cities continue to be sites of colonial violence. We know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are disproportionately targeted by police, disproportionately targeted by move-on orders. But we also know that cities are home to an increasing population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Dr. Chelsea Bond has said that the real Aboriginal people are always somewhere else. That when we think about an authentic Aboriginal person, we're always displacing them, always thinking about them as being further out from where we are, more remote, more distant, and perhaps even somewhere else. Sometimes we displace them to another kind of temporal sphere. And of course, this policing of realness, of the authenticity of indigeneity is a deflecting mechanism. It's a way to avoid taking responsibility for the impacts of colonialism and the ongoing practices of colonialism. But it's also wrapped up in dichotomous ways that we think about cities and nature, cities and the environment. We, in the West, tend to think about cities as sites of civilization and of culture, and lots of scare quotes here, and we think about nature as belonging to beyond cities, beyond the outskirts of cities, some kind of wild and primitive beyond. And of course, that is the zone to which Indigenous people have also been placed as part of the colonial project. Which means that Indigenous people in cities are often seen as incongruous, as being seen as out of place, as matter out of place, which of course then is linked to why they are disproportionately targeted by police. But what we need to do now as part of struggles for urban space is face up to urban indigeneity as a mode of existence. To acknowledge not only that traditional owners of lands that are cities are still traditional owners. The land is still here. Cities are also homelands. But also the practices of Indigenous people may be reconstituting Indigenous modes of existence in cities. So Indigenous culture continues to flourish, to grow, to exist in cities. Perhaps in new ways, perhaps in interesting new ways, particularly for Indigenous people who have been long displaced from homeland, who may not know where their homelands are. They are still Indigenous and they are still practicing urban indigeneity if they live in cities. And perhaps, the non-Indigenous among us, which includes myself, may sometimes struggle to see it, may struggle to hear it and to feel it, but that land is still here. It is still sacred and it is still breathing. And I think we can start to understand this maybe a little bit through this idea of multinaturalism, which I talked about a little bit earlier. The idea that there are multiple realities co-constituting and coexisting with one another at any given point, that cities are actually layers of landscapes. And some of us walk in one, some of us walk in others, and some people walk between. Ghassan Haj wrote, drawing on the work of Virios de Castro, that we are continuously shadowed by the realities of which we are dwelling, of which we are not fully aware, but which often induce in us a vague feeling or a sense of their presence. Being other than what we are is not just conceptually possible, it is materially possible, since one is already dwelling in that otherness. So part of the project, I think, of imagining a right to the city that exists alongside and supports the project of decolonisation and justice for Indigenous peoples might start with learning to recognise that our cities exist in and are indeed multiple realities already. That indigeneity is not extinguished in cities, it lives here, it grows here too. The rights and responsibilities we can sometimes begin to understand as applying in more remote and unbuilt areas have not been erased. Concrete doesn't smother them, and nor do they wither in the shadows of buildings. Another tension is around electoral politics versus prefigurative politics. So this is always like, I mean, I won't spend too much time on this because I think it's pretty obvious. But there's always a struggle in social movements between the relationship between a radical social movement and electoral kinds of politics. Now, as I mentioned, the genesis of Right to the City of Brisbane lies, at least in part, with a campaign to get Jonathan Sri elected to Councillor of the Gabba Ward. Jonathan Sri is a poet, musician, community organiser, has what would be called radical politics, and his campaign for election brought together a bunch of people who became Right to the City of Brisbane, or the start of it at least. And this was my own entry to the project, was speaking at a community conference organised by his campaign. And Jono's done some really exciting and fantastic things since his election. He's been putting things on the agenda that would otherwise be ignored, and has been trialling participatory budgeting and other really interesting forms of kind of radical governance, radical urban governance. But of course, there is a tension here, right, between prefigurative and electoral politics. And it's not just a matter of where activists should be directing their attention. There's always questions about resources and time and where energy is best spent. But it's also that there is a tension between the prefigurative approach as well, that even a radical, once holding electoral office, is then bound up with that office. Like that's undeniable. They may do fantastic and challenging things with the resources and powers afforded by that office. They may be able to illuminate issues and struggles that would otherwise stay hidden, and make visible the kind of contingent processes through which our cities are being governed and produced. And we've seen Councillor Sri do all of those things. But ultimately, the kind of change is regulatory, statutory. That's the aim, right? That's the space in which that kind of politics works. Prefigurative politics is not about waiting for regulatory change. It can be covert. It may break laws rather than make them. Prefigurative approaches to politics don't ignore the state because there's a critique of the state, but it's approaches to create new structures rather than, almost to act as though the state doesn't exist and see that as the site of intervention. I mean, I think there's absolutely space for these. I mean, I think these things must coexist in the struggle for a just city. They must. Both things have to happen. But they can't be conflated or equated, and there may always be some tensions in the short-term goals of these different approaches to politics. The last tension I'd like to talk to you about is around this idea of more than human cities. So I come at my politics from environmentalism originally. That's where I came to my political and values birth. But Right to the City work has really often neglected environmental issues, has often neglected sustainability, and often just city work has too, although some of the interesting work on climate justice and environmental justice puts the environment back into cities. But certainly Right to the City work and new municipalism generally don't talk much about the environment, generally don't talk much about the ecological impacts of cities or the ecological production of cities. And again, I think this comes back to part of that dichotomous construction of this city, that we see the city as this built up thing, the environment is displaced beyond the city limits. But I think there's interesting work that we can draw on here to think about cities as being already more than human, which then raises questions about who gets a right to this city. If we think about cities as being home and habitat to people, well, to beings that are not merely human. I think we can look to work on urban ecology, on queer ecology, on assemblage theory, and work on the emerging work on kind of the more than human as an idea, to imagine a just city in which social, spatial, and environmental justice are not only coexisting, but that are deemed to be co-constituting. We see these things as being inherently wrapped up with one another. And environmental justice activists and scholars have been working for decades to highlight the links between city environments and toxicity and health, and the ways that those things are attached to social locations and political locations. And environmental justice also makes collective claims about centering the way that certain injustices in cities are borne by certain collectivities. And I think we can add to that some of the work on urban ecologies and queer ecologies. Early urban ecology was really focused on like parks and green spaces and riparian zones and green corridors, which again, I think positions the environment as a thing that can exist in the like little pockets in cities. But what we're starting to see now in urban ecology and in queer ecology is thinking about the city itself as an ecosystem. Think about the entire city assemblage as this kind of emerging phenomena, is a quote from Alberti, of which people are significant but not entirely deterministic. So can we then reconceptualize cities not as just this thing that humans have made and done, but as interacting, co-constituting assemblages? A city made of material and energetic flows, of exchanges between biotic and built, organic and inorganic, human and non-human, technological and effective, economic and embodied, infrastructural and relational, political and material, governable and ungovernable elements. And can we think about them as having emerged in landscapes geological, emotional, cultural, and multiple? If we understand cities as not entirely artificial human constructions, not separate from an environmental context, just impacting it from the outside, if we understand them as not detached from ecosystemic relations, if we understand them as human habitats but not exclusively so, then maybe we can start to think about a more than human right to the city. Because if the city being claimed in right to the city discourse is understood as being built on these queer, more than human assemblages and ecosystems with blurred and shifting boundaries, then the collective that can exercise a claim to the right to the city must be a more than human collective. Yeah, I know, sorry, I know that's like a lot. This is a kind of new area that I'm trying to think through at the moment, trying to blend these claims for social, spatial, and environmental justice. Yeah, it's a lot, but I think we can draw on this existing work to figure out how to do it. And once we get to a point where we can't neatly separate ourselves from this kind of like thrumming, relational, messy city ecosystem assemblage, if we get to that point, then it becomes conceptually difficult to defend kind of private property rights or the idea that we can accrue to oneself control that in ways that exclude and harm others who are entangled with us. And the others who are entangled with us are not just other people, they are other beings as well. And again, if we come back to that idea of the right to the cities being conferred by inhabitants, then there's already so many other more than human inhabitants in cities, and perhaps we can begin to think about their role in the just city that we are trying to build. So, right to the city Brisbane, I'm going to finish up now because I'd like to leave a bit of time for questions, is an emerging attempt, a contingent attempt to try and create an everyday, more than human spatial politics for the just city, and trying to bring it into being through daily practices, through experiments, through ephemeral interventions into urban space, and through the kinds of relationships and communities that we are building in this struggle. These urban struggles are attempting to transform material conditions by transforming the ways that city spaces are constituted and governed. These are struggles to decolonize cities, to make cities equitable, accessible, to decommodify public spaces, to centre people over profit, to participate in the production of cities, to appropriate the spaces that do not work for us, to knit us into relationships of care with each other, to knit us into relationships of care and mutual obligation with the more than human, to make cities sustainable eco-assemblages, to work in the cracks of the concrete to make other futures possible, to reclaim a horizon, and to have a sense of hope, to make for each other the points of light through the curtain through which we can start to see that there might be something beautiful and possible beyond that. And that's me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, that was great.